Chapter 2 On American Feminism. In the radical feminist view, the new feminism is not just the revival of a serious political movement for social equality. It is the second wave of the most important revolution in history. Its aim, overthrow of the oldest, most rigid class/caste system in existence, the class system based on sex. A system consolidated over thousands of years, lending the archetypal male and female roles an undeserved legitimacy and seeming permanence. In this perspective, the pioneer Western feminist movement was only the first onslaught, the 50-year ridicule that followed it only a first counteroffensive, the dawn of a long struggle to break free from the oppressive power structures set up by nature and reinforced by man. In this light, let's take a look at American feminism. 1. The women's rights movement in America. Though there have always been women rebels in history, footnote, for example, witches must be seen as women in independent political revolt. Within 2 centuries, 8 million women were burned at the stake by the church, for religion was the politics of that period. End footnote. The conditions have never before existed that would enable women to effectively overthrow their oppressive roles. Women's capacity for reproduction was urgently needed by the society, and even if it hadn't been, effective birth control methods were not available. So until the Industrial Revolution, feminist rebellion was bound to remain only a personal one. The coming feminist revolution of the age of technology was foreshadowed by the thought and writing of individual women, members of the intellectual elites of their day. In England, Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. In America, Margaret Fuller. In France, the Blue Stockings. But these women were ahead of their time. They had a hard time getting their ideas accepted, even in their own advanced circles, let alone by the masses of men and women of their day, who had barely absorbed the first shock of the Industrial Revolution. By the middle of the 19th century, however, with industrialization in full swing, a full-fledged feminist movement was underway. Always strong in the U.S., itself founded shortly before the Industrial Revolution, and thus having comparatively little history tradition, feminism was spurred on by the abolitionist struggle and the smoldering ideas of the American Revolution itself. The Declaration passed at the First National Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in 1848 was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. The early American women's rights movement was radical. In the 19th century, for women to attack the family, the church, see Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Woman's Bible, and the state, law, was for them to attack the very cornerstones of the Victorian society in which they lived, equivalent to attacking sex distinctions themselves in our own time. The theoretical foundations of the early women's rights movement grew out of the most radical ideas of the day, notably those of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and such communalists as R.D. Owen and Fanny Wright. Few people today are aware that the early feminism was a true grassroots movement. They haven't heard of the torturous journeys made by feminist pioneers into backwoods and frontiers, or door to door in the towns to speak about the issues or to collect signatures for petitions that were laughed right out of the assemblies. Nor do they know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the most militant feminists of the movement, were among the first to stress the importance of organizing women workers, founding the Working Women's Association in September 1868. Delegates to the National Labor Union Convention as early as 1868, they later fell out over the shortchanging of women workers by the hasn't changed male chauvinist labor movement. Other pioneer female labor organizers, such as Augusta Lewis and Kate Maloney, were in the feminist movement. This radical movement was built by women who had literally no civil status under the law, who were pronounced civilly dead upon marriage, or who remained legal minors if they did not marry, who could not sign a will or even have custody of their own children upon divorce, who were not taught even to read, let alone admitted to college. The most privileged of them were equipped with a knowledge of embroidery, china painting, French, and harpsichord, who had no political voice whatever. Thus, even after the Civil War, more than half this country's population was still legally enslaved, literally not owning even the bustles on their backs. The first stirrings of this oppressed class, the first simple demands for justice, were met by a disproportionate violence, a resistance difficult to understand today when the lines of sexual class have been blurred over. For, as often happens, the revolutionary potential of the First Awakening was recognized more clearly by those in power than it was by the Crusaders themselves. From its very beginning, the feminist movement posed a serious threat to the established order, its very existence and long duration testifying to fundamental inequalities in a system that pretended to democracy. Working first together, later separately, the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement threatened to tear the country apart. If, in the Civil War, the feminists hadn't been persuaded to abandon their cause to work on more important issues, the early history of feminist revolution might have been less dismal. As it was, although the Stanton-Anthony forces struggled on in the radical feminist tradition for 20 years longer, the back of the movement had been broken. Thousands of women, at the impetus of the Civil War, had been allowed out of the home to do charity work. The only issue on which these very different camps of organized women could unite was the desirability of the vote. But predictably, they did not agree upon why it was desirable. The conservatives formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, or joined the sprouting women's clubs, such as the pious Woman's Christian Temperance Union. The radicals separated into the National Woman's Suffrage Association, concerned with the vote only as a symbol of the political power they needed to achieve larger ends. By 1890, further legal reforms had been won. Women had entered the labor force in the service capacity that they still hold today, and they had begun to be educated in larger numbers. In lieu of true political power, they had been granted a token, segregated place in the public sphere as club women. But though indeed this was a greater political power than before, it was only a new-fangled version of female power of the usual sort. Behind the throne, a traditional influence on power, which took modern form in lobbying and embarrassment tactics. When, in 1890, with their leaders old and discouraged, the radical feminist National merged with the conservative American to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, all seemed lost. Conservative feminism, with its concentration on broad, unitive, single issues like suffrage, with its attempt to work within and placate the white male power structure, trying to convince men who knew better with their own fancy rhetoric yet, had won. Feminism, sold out, languished. Even worse than the conservative feminists were the increasing number of women who, with their newfound bit of freedom, jumped enthusiastically into all the radicalisms of the day, the various social reform movements of the progressive era, even when at odds with feminist interests. Consider the old debate about discriminatory protective labor laws for women. Margaret Ronda, Britain's leading post-World War I feminist, put it this way, quote, "One may divide the women in the women's movement into two groups, the feminists and the reformers who are not in the least feminists, who do not care tuppence about equality for itself. Now, almost every women's organization recognizes that reformers are far more common than feminists, that the passion to decide to look after your fellow men, to do good to them in your way, is far more common than the desire to put into everyone's hand the power to look after themselves." End quote. These reformers, the women radicals of their day, were at best influenced by feminism. They were neither true feminists nor true radicals because they did not yet see the women's cause as a legitimate radical issue in itself. By seeing the women's rights movement as only tangent to another, more important politics, they were in a sense viewing themselves as defective men. Women's issues seemed to them special, sectarian, while issues that concerned men were human, universal. Developing politically in movements dominated by men, they became preoccupied with reforming their position within those movements rather than getting out and creating their own. The Women's Trade Union League is a good example. Women politicos in this group failed at the most basic undertakings because they were unable to sever their ties with the strongly male chauvinist AFL under Samuel Gompers, which sold them out time and again. Or, in another example, like so many VISTA volunteers bent on slumming it with an ungrateful poor, they rushed into the young settlement movement, many of them giving their lives without reward, only to become the rather grim, embittered, but devoted spinster social workers of the stereotype. Or the Women's Peace Party, founded to no avail by Jane Addams on the eve of American intervention in World War I, which later split into, ironically, either jingoist groups working for the war effort or radical pacifists as ineffective as they were extreme. This frenzied feminine organizational activity of the progressive era is often confused with the women's rights movement proper. But the image of the frustrated, bossy battle axe derives less from the radical feminists than from the non-feminist politicos, committee women for the various important causes of their day. In addition to the now defunct movements we have mentioned, the Women's Trade Union League, the National Federation of Settlements, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, formerly the Women's Peace Party begun by Jane Addams, the whole spectrum of organized ladyhood was founded in an era between 1890 and 1920. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, the League of Women Voters, the American Association of Collegiate Alumnae, the National Consumers League, the PTA, even the DAR. Although these organizations were associated with the most radical movements of their day, that in fact their politics were reactionary and finally fatuous and silly was indicated at first solely by their non-feminist views. Thus, the majority of organized women in the period between 1890 to 1920, a period usually cited as a high point of feminist activity, had nothing to do with feminism. On the one hand, feminism had been constricted to the single issue of the vote. The women's rights movement was, temporarily, transformed into a suffrage movement, and on the other, women's energies were diffused into any other radical cause but their own. But radical feminism was only dormant. The awakening began with the return of Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, from England, where she had joined the militant Women's Social and Political Union. The English suffragettes, of whom the Pankhursts are perhaps the best known, in opposing the constitutionalists, conservative feminists. Believing that militant tactics were needed to achieve the radical goals espoused by her mother, she recommended attacking the problem of the vote with the discarded strategy of the Stanton-Anthony faction, pressure to amend the federal constitution. Soon the American militants split off from the conservative NAWSA to form the Congressional Union, later the Woman's Party, beginning the daring guerrilla tactics and uncompromisingly tough line for which the whole suffrage movement is often incorrectly credited. It worked. Militants had to undergo embarrassment, mobbings, beatings, even hunger strikes with forced feeding, but within a decade, the vote was won. The spark of radical feminism was just what the languishing suffrage movement needed to push through their single issue. It provided a new and sound approach, the pressure for a national amendment, rather than the tedious state-by-state organizing method used for over 30 years. A militancy that dramatized the urgency of the woman issue, and above all, a wider perspective, one in which the vote was seen as only the first of many goals, and therefore to be won as quickly as possible. The mild demands of the conservative feminists, who had all but pleaded that if they won the vote they wouldn't use it, were welcomed as by far the lesser of two evils in comparison with the demands of the Woman's Party. But with the granting of the vote, the establishment co-opted the women's movement. As one gentleman of that period, quoted by William O'Neill in Everyone Was Brave, summarized it, quote, "Nevertheless, women's suffrage is a good thing, if only to have it over with." End quote. Mrs. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont of the Woman's Party urged women to boycott the elections. Quote, "Husband your new power. Suffragists did not fight for your emancipation for 70 years to have you become servants to men's parties." End quote. Charlotte Perkins Gilman seconded this. Quote, "The power women will be able to exercise lies in their not joining a party system of men. The party system of politics is a trick of men to conceal the real issues. Women should work for the measures they want outside of party politics. It is because the old political parties realize that women's influence will be so negligible on the inside that they are so eager to get women to join them." End quote. But none of this was to any avail. Even the formation of a new Women's Party on February 18, 1921, as an alternative to the major parties that were so rapidly absorbing women's new political strength, could not resuscitate the dying movement. Footnote: the Women's Party struggled on through a depression and several wars, campaigning for the next big legal boost to women's freedom, an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. 50 years later, those who are still alive are still campaigning. The stereotype of the crotchety old lady with her umbrella, obsessed with a cause already won, is the comic product of the ossification of feminism created by the 50-year ridicule. End footnote. The granting of the vote to the suffrage movement killed the women's rights movement. Though the anti-feminist forces appeared to give in, they did so in name only. They never lost. By the time the vote was granted, the long channeling of feminist energies into the limited goal of suffrage, seen initially as only one step to political power, had thoroughly depleted the women's rights movement. The monster ballot had swallowed everything else. 3 generations had elapsed from the time of the inception of the women's rights movement. The master planners were all dead. The women who later joined the feminist movement to work for the single issue of the vote had never had time to develop a broader consciousness. By then, they had forgotten what the vote was for. The opposition had had its way. Of all that struggle, what is even remembered? The fight for suffrage alone, not worth much to women, as later events bore out, was an endless war against the most reactionary forces in America at the time, which, as Eleanor Flexner shows in Century of Struggle, included the biggest capitalist interests of the North, i.e., oil, manufacturing, railroad, and liquor interests. The racist bloc of southern states which, in addition to their own bigotry about women, were afraid to grant the woman's vote because it would enfranchise another half of the Negro race, as well as draw attention to the hypocrisy of universal male suffrage. And, finally, the machine of government itself. The work involved to achieve this vote was staggering. Carrie Chapman Catt estimated that, quote, "To get the word male out of the Constitution cost the women of this country 52 years of pauseless campaign. During that time, they were forced to conduct 56 campaigns of referenda to male voters, 480 campaigns to get legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get state constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state constitutions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party conventions to adopt women's suffrage planks in party platforms, and 19 successive campaigns with 19 successive Congresses." End quote. Thus defeat was so frequent and victory so rare, and then achieved by such bare margins, that even to read about the struggle for suffrage is exhausting, let alone to have lived through it and fought for it. The lapse of historians in this area is understandable, if not pardonable. But, as we have seen, suffrage was only one small aspect of what the women's rights movement was all about. 100 years of brilliant personalities and important events have also been erased from American history. The women orators who fought off mobs in the days when women were not allowed to speak in public, to attack family, church, and state, who traveled on poor railways to cow towns of the West to talk to small groups of socially starved women, were quite a bit more dramatic than the Scarlett O'Haras and Harriet Beecher Stowes and all the little women who have come down to us. Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman freed slaves who went back time and again with huge prices on their heads to free other slaves on their own plantations, were more effective in their efforts than the ill-fated John Brown. But most people today have never even heard of Myrtilla Minor, Prudence Crandall, Abigail Scott Duniway, Mary Putnam Jacoby, Ernestine Rose, the Claflin sisters, Crystal Eastman, Clara Lemlich, Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, Doris Stevens, Anne Martin. And this ignorance is nothing compared to ignorance of the lives of women of the stature of Margaret Fuller, Fanny Wright, the Grimke sisters, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Stanton Blatch, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Alice Paul. And yet we know about Louisa May Alcott, Clara Barton, and Florence Nightingale, just as we know about, rather than Nat Turner, the triumph of Ralph Bunche, or George Washington Carver and the Peanut. The omissions of vital characters from standard versions of American history in favor of such goody-good models cannot be tossed off, just as it would be dangerous to inspire still oppressed black children with admiration for the Nat Turners of their history. So it is with the women's rights movement. The suspicious blanks in our history books concerning feminism, or else the confusion of the whole women's rights movement with the conservative suffrage movement, or the reformist women's groups of the progressive era, is no accident. It is part of a backlash we are still undergoing in reaction to the first feminist struggle. The few strong models allowed girls growing up in the 50-year silence have been carefully chosen ones, women like Eleanor Roosevelt of the altruistic feminine tradition, as opposed to the healthily selfish giants of the radical feminist rebellion. This cultural backlash was to be expected. Men of those days grasped immediately the true nature of a feminist movement, recognizing it as a serious threat to their open and unashamed power over woman. They may have been forced to buy off the women's movement with confusing surface reforms, a correction of the most blatant inequalities on the books, a few changes of dress, sex, style. You've come a long way, baby. All of which coincidentally benefited men, but the power stayed in their hands.